Well, first, the rotating assembly. I'm going to change the camshaft into this resolute cam, which people said that it's an eagle 100 degrees cam replica, but I don't care, since later I'll dial the whole valve timing, but still, it looks a lot different than the stock ones. The first issues I've encountered is the floating tips in the end of the cam, and I suspect that the gear size and the cam thrust bearing is the main culprit, knowing it was what mostly happens in an air-cooled T1 motor. To find the best fit for this motor, I'm checking the clearance of the stock cam first, the end play as well as how well it is rotating with the crankshaft. I'm using a 180 grit sandpaper to clear the thrust bearing. Make sure to slide the thrust bearing one way only so that you won't grain it too much. And the method I'm using to fit the cam gear is definitely not recommended if you don't have a speed control for the angle grinder. And indeed, it is still looks sketchy as fuck. For reference, this crank is still too heavy to be rotated, and you'll know why later on, even though I was grinding the cam gear more off screen to make it rotate more freely. The Malay style piston oil rings consists of two parts, and this is the direction for the installation, to make sure the oil blow by into the combustion chamber isn't too much. This is the clearance advice from the service manual book, and make sure to check either side clearance and the ring gap is a must, so that the motor will run smoothly and won't burning too much oil and losing compression. Any kind of markings in the piston ring should indicate the top side of the piston ring. Take your time and find the sign. Checking the ring gap, use the piston to push the ring inward evenly. Then, I'm going to dial the whole valve timing as well as measuring the piston crown and head squish clearance, just to make sure the safe spot, since there are multiple gaskets in the head when I'm tearing the whole motor apart. Rotate the crank clockwise from the closed valve to measure the opening time, and stop the rotation after 1 mm lift are reached. After writing down the numbers, keep on rotating clockwise until the dial stops. Then, reverse it counterclockwise for another 1 mm to measure the valve closing time. This will work for any kind of motor which the rotation are clockwise. Every one rotation of the dial gates are indicating 1 mm movement. In the opening time are started when the valve lifts at 1 mm at the opening and 1 mm at the closing. Pay attention to the zero in the dial gates. Write the crank degree on the crank pulley for the measurement of the camshaft duration later on. So here is the collected data. 7 plus 29 plus 180 equals to 216 for the final intake duration, and the same goes for the exhaust. For additional data, the piston crown and head squeeze clearance are 1.6 mm without the ring gasket, measured with a soldering wire, which located in the tightest spot of the head and the piston crown. Knowing there's a little crack on the sleeve skirt, I decided to put another set of piston kit to ensure the model longevity, since it is the main model for the bus. I decided to buy the 88mm Dakar instead of the 87 Mahli, since it was just half of the Mahli prices and I'm broke as fuck. The Dakar oil rings is completely different than the Mahli ones. The same principle still applies though. Make sure its cutaway are the farthest with each other. To differentiate the first and second compression ring, pay attention to the shape. The second compression ring are shaped at 90 degrees L on the bottom and the cutaway should face to the flywheel. Here is the piston ring orientation seen from the top of the piston. As always, pay attention to the arrow which have to face towards the flywheel. The part thing I've done was just mostly changing the other parts of the intake, shaping the part into uppercase D. The purposes for making the other part bigger is to increase the air and gas mixture velocity. Imagine when you're washing your car with a hose and you're crimping the end of the hose, which making the water to be faster. Well, the same law applies in this context. If you're wondering how to match the part between one side and another, use the valve as a tool and mark the depth with tape. You'll know when to stop grinding then. Further, I'm not grinding the inner parts of the part too much since it is the weakest part of the head, mostly nearby the valve guides, knowing that air-cooled T1 motor is so weak. But for the exhaust part, decreasing the angle of the part is preferred as long as paying attention to the wall thickness so that you won't destroy the heads. Installing the valves doesn't get much easier as well. Knowing that I'll be using used heads and valves, making sure there are no leaks is a full day job. Fill the part with water to see any leaks in the valve. If there's none, you're good to go. Pay attention to the tone when you're doing the valve job, even though most of the exhaust is harder, so it is fine if you wanted to use the drill instead of your own hands as long as you'll still keep on testing in short period of time. Otherwise, the valve spring rate will weaken when the valve sunk too much into the valve seat. Further, using the smoother grinding paste is preferred for used heads.